In this module, we're going to be looking a little bit more at that bottom-up approach, or looking at the individual and how the individual actually falls into an organization and is important to the organization. So again, before we start talking about organizations, or for that matter, even groups and teams, we need to understand better the individual. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on here. And there's a common saying in industrial organizational psychology that perception is reality. And this is not quite accurate. Reality is quote unquote reality. But no matter what you're doing, if it's being perceived differently, that's probably what's more important. How people perceive things is an important part of organizational life. So we're going to talk about perceptions. We're going to talk a little bit about how people form their own social identities and how that social identity then influences their perceptions. And then we're going to transition to using that knowledge to better inform how we basically do training, learning, and reactions within the workplace. So the first question we can think about when we talk about social perceptions is, who do we think we are? So how do you define yourselves? It seems to be a simple question, but it actually can be a very, very complex answer as far as how you perceive yourself. Who do you perceive as your in groups, the groups that you belong to? For instance, you might consider yourself psychology major. That would be an in group. You might consider yourself a student at the particular university you're at. You might consider yourself a member of your family, a member of relationships that you have, but you might also consider the various social groups that you belong to, various organizations, and also you might categorize yourself by various skills or knowledge or interests that you have. All of these start to develop who you are and your social identity, how you present that information to others. And as we think about it, it also changes greatly as we continue to grow, develop, and present ourselves into different roles. So obviously, at a very young age, we'd expect your interests to be mainly focused on your family, maybe a little bit school, and maybe your hobbies. As you actually start becoming a college student, that might be expanded by the organizations that you're involved with. And as you enter the workforce and further education, you might start identifying yourselves more about with the relationships and families that you've created, your coworkers, and your organization. So social identity theory is basically the idea that we're creating a personal identity and those characteristics that define a particular individual. So what do we think is important and how we identify ourselves and how we actually look at the world? And obviously, depending on how you were raised, the types of exposures you had as a child, the types of experiences you've had as an adult, all are going to influence how you look at the world, as well as the culture that you grew up in and the expectations and how you were raised. So all of these can result in those individual differences. And social identity theory tries to start to get at this idea of how do we actually quantify that and how do we incorporate that when we're talking about human behavior, especially within the workplace. So social identity theory is basically the idea that who a person is defined in many ways in terms of his or her membership in various social groups. So though a part of our identity, of course, will be our own skills, our own beliefs, our own kind of concepts, and our own learning experiences, a lot of our identity is actually tied up into the groups that we belong to. So, and of course, obviously, our business work groups, our business teams, our culture, all are going to impact that as well. So a lot of times when we ask someone, who are you, we can get various different responses. If you asked me, I would probably say I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. I would also say that I am a father. Now, the second I said both of those, that's also including some of this idea of social identity. When I say I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, I'm also taking ownership that I'm in a group of people with similar skills. When I say I'm a father, I'm also acknowledging my membership in a close-knit family. I might go on to say that currently I'm a senior consultant at Aon. Again, that's now incorporating a skill set, but also a job title, but again, in a broader social context, the company that I work for. I might say that I'm an adjunct professor at this university. Again, that is not only defining who I am, what I do, and maybe some of my skills, but it's also placing myself into a social group. I might refer to I'm a good friend, and I might start to refer to things that I enjoy. I enjoy collecting, for example, fine bourbons. But again, is that done in isolation? No, that also involves me going to various distilleries, hanging out with other people with similar likes. So even when we talk about our own individual interests, a lot of times a part of that, either in how we define it or in the definition itself, includes membership in social groups. So social identity theory in itself, here is a definition, is a conceptualization recognizing that the way we perceive others and ourselves are based on our unique characteristics, our personal identity, and our membership in various social groups, our social identity. So personal identity might be, I tend to be level-headed. I might be grouping myself in with other people that are level-headed, but that's a fairly individual trait. I like to think that I'm honest. That's a personal identity. I like to think that I'm trustworthy. That's a personal identity. But many of the ways I define myself include my membership in various groups, and those would be both formal groups, but also informal friendship groups, people that I've gone to college with. I would often define myself, especially when I was in graduate school, by the people that I went to graduate school with. So social identity theory is basically recognizing that those two major components, our personality and our personal identity, and our social identity, are the two biggest predictors of how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive others. And this is an important underlying concept when we start thinking about job satisfaction. One of the reasons job satisfaction has such an impact is that it's basically how we're perceiving ourselves relative to a social group, our workplace. So again, we want to really kind of focus in a little bit on this concept, and we also want to be considering this as we move forward in any of the interventions we might talk about that psychology suggests for business settings. So again, basically speaking, that we have our personal identity and our social identity. Personal identity is going to be mainly characteristics. They can include things as simple as I'm 6 foot tall, I'm outgoing, I'm interested in sports. And all of those would actually be close to defining me. I'm actually 6'2". I tend to be fairly extroverted and outgoing, and I am just generally interested in sports. I've been involved in sports most of my life. But interestingly enough, my social identity really doesn't include sports. I really only enjoy one-on-one or individual competition sports, and that's what I've mainly been involved with. And when I'm not actually doing those sports, I have very little interest in following them. So I would say that would probably very much fall into a personal identity, though for some people that might be both a personal identity and a social identity. I'm interested in sports, I play football, and I'm a member of a football team. You can see how we move from one to the other. Social identity is mainly the groups which I belong. For example, I'm an American, I'm an employee of a company, I'm a student at a big state university. And therefore, when I'm thinking about not only myself, when I start comparing myself to other individuals, this is also how I'm going to perceive them. What are their personal identity and characteristics, and what groups do they belong to? The more I perceive those personal identities are similar to mine, and the groups that we belong to are similar or the same, generally speaking, the more open I'm going to be, the more responsive I'm going to be, and the more positive I'm going to view that person. If I perceive that their personal identity, their personal characteristics are very different from mine, and their social identity is basically very different groups than mine, that's generally going to start leading me to have the perception that I might have to be a little more careful. I really don't know this person very well, and I don't have a lot of common with this person, which might also result in me being a little bit more negative in my actions. And that's where we start to apply social identity to perception and how we perceive others and how we behave towards others. So moving into the next module, when we talk about social perception, we're integrating and interpreting information about others to gain an accurate understanding of them. And just as we understand ourselves as a function of our private selves or our personality or our traits and our social groups, we also tend to view others in those same ways. So how we process this incoming information regarding how others are in order to formulate an idea of what that person is. Generally speaking, one of the things that psychology has found ever since we first started studying human behavior is social behavior. We have a tendency to want to not only know about our own social position, but to know about the social position of others. And we also then want to be able to predict how other people are going to behave. And a lot of our actual negatives that we sometimes find in our own behavior, for example, stereotyping and bias, is often this natural tendency to want to guess how other people are going to behave based on the information we have. We're going to transition into the next module about attribution, which is the process through which individuals attempt to determine the causes behind other behavior. In other words, simply why did that person behave in that way? And attributions are very important because we tend to attribute our own behaviors to outside influences. In other words, if we behave in a way that we know may not be socially desirable, we rarely think it's because we're not socially desirable. We usually very much recognize the situation and the external influences that result in us behaving that way. However, this tends to flip when we make attributions about others. When we see other people behave in what we would consider a socially inappropriate way, we have a tendency to believe that that's a reflection of who they are internally. In other words, we tend to focus on the internal because that is a way we can then understand how they behave and downplay the environment. It's one of the things we often refer to as the fundamental attribution error, that we tend to over-attend to the situation in our own behaviors and under-attend to the situation's impact on others' behaviors.